so I don't forget to do that, which happens.
Absolutely.
All right, let me just get into the right view here. Just a moment. Congratulations on the article.
Wasn't that crazy?
Oh, it's crazy. Yes, it's wonderful. And
It
that
was a
I saw that making the rounds. Has it been about a week or so? Time is so warped.
2 days.
2 days. Oh my gosh. I know I saw it and yeah.
I did that Easter Sunday. I was just kind of looking around doing some very
Oh my
strange.
goodness. How often do you contribute to Forbes? Is it a regular or is it just when you have a something you want to write about?
No, I go to both Forbes and HBR for the last few years,
Hmm.
so I try and do at least something once a month.
Okay. Okay. And so then that was that. Well, I guess that's the nature of internet. A very quick turnaround to get it published.
Well, actually, there's a big difference between the two. Interestingly,
Oh,
Forbes,
really?
Forbes, you actually control your upload. Once they've
Oh.
once they've selected you and authorized you as a contributor,
Oh, I see. Okay.
you can
Okay.
actually publish yourself.
And but HBR, there's a vetting process and
HBR, there's a very, very long.
interesting. Oh, well,
Don't
good.
don't put that on the podcast.
No, no, no.
That's
We won't talk about that.
background dirt if you ever consider going on.
Well, great. Okay. Well, so we went over a lot of the questions. I think, I want the episode to be just to be timeless, but also want to address the elephant that's in the room, which is the current pandemic. And so I will start out talking about that because I think it speaks a lot to the leadership of the women, and I think our listeners would really have a lot to gain from hearing from you about that. And so we'll start with that, and then we'll move into everything else that we had already kind of previewed. Does that
You're on.
sound good?
You're on.
Okay.
I'm ready to roll.
All right. And, if the recording is going to be running, but obviously on the podcast, and there is editing. And so if you have anything else you want to reword or start over, you're welcome to. And I may do that too if I goof up.
We'll mutually goof up and support each other.
Virtually, that's wonderful. Okay, so I'll have already done your intro. Oh, I wanted to just clarify. So your the program that you have your MBA from. How do you call it INSEAD, or is INSEAD? How do you what's the best way to say
Insane. It's called
in?
insane.
Oh, your connection got a little
Insane.
bit funky there.
Yeah, I think
Well,
it's because there were little messages coming in, so I can't
oh.
stop.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it kind of turned into the robot voice.
Let me close down my
Okay.
messaging and email, and that will maybe help our.
And you said it's instead, like instead, but without the T.
No, it's INSEAD.
Instead.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. INSEAD. Okay, so I'll just make sure I pronounce that correctly when I do that recording, which I'll do separately.
They will appreciate that, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm sure the question comes up a lot, right? Okay, let me just get everything settled here so I don't have to reach around too much with my papers. Thanks for bearing with me. I'm in my makeshift studio, which is my closet for the best sound insulation.
Absolutely. I know all about closets. They're great.
Okay. All right. Okay, so I'll pause for a second and then we'll get started.
Oh.
And I'm saying it correctly, Avivah Wittenberg-Cox.
That's it.
Okay. Okay.
And
it's all right if I just call you Avivah during the interview. Okay. All right, here we go. Pause. Hello, Aviva. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with me today.
My great pleasure.
Thank you. Well, I gave a little bit of an intro for you before we started talking, but I would love to hear from your words a little bit about what your upbringing was like and how you ended up where you were and the influences in your childhood.
Influences in my childhood. Big question that's certainly linked to today. I'm all mixed up, like a lot of people on this planet.
Hmm.
So I was born in Canada, in Toronto, in Quebec, actually, French-speaking Quebec, to
Hmm.
a French mother and a Swiss father, which kindly gave me three nationalities and three very different cultures to work between and from. So I grew up a bit of a misfit in very kind of Anglo-Saxon conservative Toronto, which was not at the time the cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, gorgeous international city it has since become. Um, and I was a bit of a misfit with a very argumentative family. My father died when I was only three, so I was actually
Oh.
raised by what became a single mom who
Yeah.
did a terrific job with two elder brothers. So you can imagine, single mom, two elder brothers. That just basically summarizes everything I've done since.
Right.
It gave me a very strong sense of female leadership,
Hmm.
female wisdom, an astonishing, wonderful mum who was a Holocaust survivor and went on to, with no education, to go back to school, get a university degree while raising three children on her own in a city where she did not speak the language because she was French. So yes, I have a bit of a benchmark issue between me and my mum, and so any kind of difficulties I might come up with in life are rendered quite substantially insignificant by my uh, mother's experiences of life. So I sail through on her coattails and her role modeling. And I had two older brothers who toughened me up to the ways of the masculine culture of the world. I had to stay on my toes, be very argumentative. We had a very argumentative dinner table, and I was the little girl and the last born. Um, so I figured out how to become kind of bilingual between
Hmm.
masculine feminine cultures, between cultural cultures, between Canadian culture, my home culture, cross religions. And that's something I've carried out through life, right? I re-emigrated back to Paris at, after I finished college at the age of 19, 20. And stayed in Paris for 30 years. That's where I have
Wow.
done most of my professional life, started a couple of companies there, which I'm sure we'll discuss, but has had a profound influence on the languages I think in Dream In, the cultures I navigate between, and the fact that I'm such a committed feminist because I have seen in living color what it can deliver.
You definitely had to hold your own growing up, right?
I had to hold my own, but I also had a very solid line of defense.
That's
Nobody,
great.
nobody fussed with my mom. And if I had to bring in the big army of mother, I
Yeah,
had a pretty committed ally.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I talked a little bit in your introduction about what you do, and obviously central to what you do right now is being CEO of 21st, and but you're also a speaker. You've done multiple TEDx talks. You're an author. I want to talk about a an article that just came out 2 days ago. As we speak, we are in the midst of a world pandemic, the COVID situation. And your recent article in Forbes talks about how certain countries have really been shining examples in how to manage the crisis on multiple fronts. And in your article, you talk about something that these countries have in common. Can you tell me a little bit about this?
Yeah, I mean, I was reading about all these countries, and you listen. We've been all media consumers, I think, now, and so I've been watching how I think, to me, this whole COVID crisis has been what I call a revelation.
Mhm.
I think people and systems are revealed in crisis on multiple levels. I think on country leadership level, on a company leadership level, and on a couple leadership level, and even on an individual self leadership level. And so I was actually writing a blog about this very complicated, all these different levels and what I was seeing, and then it suddenly occurred to me, my goodness, all these countries that I'm reading about, a lot of them, not all of them, I want to stress, but a lot of them had something strange in common, and they were led by women. And I just thought, wow, look at, isn't it interesting? And when I started digging a little bit into these different countries, whether it was Taiwan or Germany or Finland, um, it was interesting to see just how different some of these women leaders sounded, conducted themselves. And so I highlighted what kind of came across to me as particularly marked in their leadership style. And it was truth, decisiveness, tech, and love. Uh, and those were kind of the four things I described in this blog, which went insanely viral because somehow it resonated, I think, with the hunger we have
Mhm.
for a different tone from the top of our countries. And I
Clearly.
think women were so straight talking. They told the truth. They did not obfuscate, they didn't complicate, they didn't aggrandize, they just told us simply the harsh reality of what we were up against. And I mentioned Merkel in particular, who very early on, while the country I'm living in the UK, we were still denying and saying and flutzing about, she just came out and said, yes, 70% of us are going to catch this thing. It's serious. Let's get serious. And I just thought it was such a contrast to me. It wasn't like scaremongering. It wasn't made for effect. It was made to educate with the reality of what we were up against. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And then I thought a lot of these women, counter to all the stereotypes about how soft we
Mhm.
are and how, we're so nice. No, we are super decisive. And so I used Taiwan and as an example. The next, practically the next week after the first cases were found, Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, who had no access to the WHO, isn't allowed to join in, is excluded from that group, came in with 124 measures that she was going to impose because of this crisis. And out it rolled very clearly. And she massively managed to contain this crisis. And
I'm
I just
sorry,
went
it
on
cut
from there.
out for a
But it was,
second. Can you go back to she massively contained this crisis? It cut out for a little bit.
so in the end, I mean, what was so impressive is how she massively contained this crisis. And they've had almost no deaths at all in
Yeah.
Taiwan.
Yeah. I mean, here in Portland alone, I think we're probably at this moment in um, maybe the 50s, I think, as far as how many deaths we have, and that's one kind of small to mid-sized city, and for them to be able to count on one hand the number of deaths really speaks to that. I really like how you pointed out the love component, leading with love. Can you tell me a little bit about how you described that in your article?
Yeah, and I want to just stress that I didn't start with love because love is, of course, what we think of when we think about women, right? So I made it very clear that actually most of the things these women were doing
Mhm.
were stereotypically male, straight talking, decisiveness, use of technology. But yes, the tone with which they talk and the driving force behind their policy making seemed so clearly bathed in empathy and love and care for their populations that it was very striking. And I pulled up the example of Norway, where Ms. Sorberg, had now two special press conferences dedicated to explaining what the hell was going on to children, which I think is just, it struck me so much, and it struck so many people because that too went viral as an innovation. Like, why did we never think that in times of crisis, it would be useful to explain to the more junior parts of our population in a dedicated fashion like she did that this might be necessary? And I thought that was a really, really interesting innovation.
And that brings me to another talking point, and that is as you know, in this podcast, we are talking to women who are thriving and excelling in fields that more traditionally are dominated by men. And I feel like in many of these fields, we are expected to shed some of the feminine qualities to be able to get ahead, so to say. And I think for a long time it was felt by many women that's what it was in my field, in orthopedic surgery, where as the title of the podcast goes, we're 6% of practicing orthopedic surgeons. Now, when you bring up the concept of leading with love and speaking to the children, that definitely highlights a little bit more of what is traditionally thought of as a feminine quality. And I'd like to get your take on how we as women leading in various fields or thriving in various fields where it's mostly men don't have to apologize or give up those qualities that we may have.
Well, I think a lot of this is about gender awareness, right? We have lived for thousands of years in a fairly patriarchal, male-dominated system that defined the rules of the game. And I think a lot of women are not entirely cognizant or fully aware. A lot of younger women like to think, as I did at their age, that gender is kind of an old construct, and now we're all post-gender and gender fluid and all this kind of thing, and it has nothing to do with anything anymore. I wish the systems in which we still work, most of the companies, most of the sectors, most of the political parties, are completely male construct, designed by men, for men, usually with partners at home who don't work. I mean, we're still in a pretty obsolete system design, even though our populations have changed enormously. And so we're in this kind of catch-up thing. And women, unfortunately, too often buy the Kool-Aid that when they join companies, they consciously and unconsciously accept that that the system they find themselves in is a meritocracy and it's fair, which it is not usually. It's profoundly biased with a strong preference for male masculine behaviors, vocabulary, metaphors, I mean, the whole business, right? And we do a tremendous amount of work adapting 3 levels of organization to become more adapted to 21st century talent and customers. Is you've got to get leaders' mindsets to shift and their skills to be adapted. And you have to get the culture itself to shift away from the kind of alpha male norms that it consciously and unconsciously embeds. I'm working on the military in one country right now. It's very interesting. It's a very male culture that wants to become more balanced. And systems, all the kind of underlying systems of how you manage, how you recruit people, how you manage careers, I can go on and on. I can bore you to tears on the details of the systemics of organizations that are designed and normed for male career patterns, male competency profiles, et cetera, et cetera. and for customers that are mostly male. And in medicine, you know it only too well that so much of the research on almost any illness has been conducted for too many years on mostly male specimens, male rats, male patients,
Mhm.
the whole story. Why are women still suffering from heart disease without enough doctors knowing that we have different symptoms? So yes, we're still in, I would controversially add, I think this is particularly true in certain countries, Anglo-Saxons in particular. I will point out the US and the UK, to some extent Australia too. It's, we bought this idea of what performance, effectiveness, efficiency, rationality, and leadership looks and sounds like. And it's unemotional. It's like a block of hard stone. It shouldn't show any emotion. If Hillary Clinton shows one tear, oh my God, then she can't lead a nation, et cetera, et cetera. So we all, men and women, been socialized. And a lot of women believe this too, right? So
Mhm.
it makes it very hard to even accept, and it's very controversial territory, of course. What are the real differences? Are there any between genders? Is
Mhm.
it just nurture or nature? It's all of those kind of tricky questions that you don't want to get into the stereotypes, and you want to make room for letting women be what they are in all their magnificent variations.
You talk about in your one of your TED Talks, that we don't need to fix women. We don't need fixing. Can you expand on that? I know you in what you're talking about now, you're already touching on that, but tell me a little bit more when you say we don't need to fix women, what you mean.
But that's kind of like the first wave reaction of a lot of companies when they try and integrate women more massively. And they find, you know, when they look at their internal data, that women aren't making it through their organizations, through the hierarchies and into more senior roles and jobs and positions. And then for the last 20 years they've been saying, so you know, what's the matter with the ladies, you know, let's help them. And so much work has gone into helping women. It's kind of, it's well-meaning. I've been involved in a lot of this stuff for a lot of years. It's well-meaning. It's like, let's help these women get through these organizations, let's build their confidence, let's empower them. And we've been doing that for a long time. And that's what I call sort of the fix the women mentality. Is there something wrong with us that needs fixing for us to be effective, high performing, and value delivering in these organizations? And I'd say it's time to stop all of that stuff. It's high time to stop all of that stuff and to start uh, empowering leaders and managers with the skills to manage what is now a majority female talent pool. 60%
Mhm.
of university graduates globally are now women. If you don't know how to attract, retain, and develop them, you will not survive this century. And we just don't have the skills. Sometimes we have the will in management and leadership, but we very rarely still have the skills being able to manage really effectively both genders, or should I say all the genders these days.
Mhm.
There,
Mhm.
there are 52 of them now and counting.
Right. I would like to know a little bit about how you came to found the company 21st, which you're CEO of. What led to the founding of this? And tell me a little bit about the pivots that were required in doing so.
Um, well, there are probably a couple of pivots. I was running other businesses. I've been pretty well a lifelong entrepreneur and self-employed type. When I had my second child, I moved out to the suburbs and suddenly was surrounded by a lot of women who did not work. And this was not my usual tribe. And so I decided I would create a nonprofit, kind of informal lunch club that got together professional women who worked, just because I was trying to figure out how to balance the whole thing, how to do work and life and everything. And it grew to be over a decade that I ran this nonprofit kind of on the side. It became one of Europe's largest professional women's network. We did all the women's stuff. It was great. I mean, we did leadership training for women and entrepreneurship building and lots of studies and lobbying. We did some of the very first surveys of women on boards and lobbying for getting more women on boards. And a lot of companies kept coming to me as the president of this. It's called Global PWN now. For advice on how to manage their own internal issues. And so I initially founded a company that was focused on women's leadership and coaching for executive women, something that has since become very familiar. This was back in the early 2000s. And the pivot that I had after a few years of working with a lot of women and empowering them was that did not solve the systemic issues. So in 2005, I completely flipped our model, our business model, to say this is actually a leadership issue. And since 2005, we've really been focused on working with executive teams and CEOs and leadership of large organizations to help them skill up and build an understanding of, if they want a gender balance, how to do it and how not to do it.
What were some of the biggest obstacles that you ran into trying to get leadership of various organizations and companies to buy into the concept?
Well, I think a lot of women underestimate how ready some companies are to do this, and how often they have been told, mostly by women, to introduce fix the women strategies, right? Because we thought that is what we needed. And we like, the trouble with the fix the women approach is everybody likes it. Women love it because we love our women's networks and we love leadership training. We love attention. We love recognition. And we don't know, when we're enjoying these things, that it doesn't suffice to change the balance, which we may want to do. And the men are very happy because they feel like they're helping the ladies, and they're doing everything they possibly can and everything they were told and asked to do by their own women. And so everybody's happy. It just doesn't change anything. So that's why I think so those are the obstacles we face, is to reframe the opportunity that gender balance offers as a competitive advantage for companies, which is an idea that a lot of senior leaders are more open to than we know. It's just that they're not really getting that message from necessarily their own people or other people. So part of it is how everybody's framing and approaching the subject, who they're engaging with and at what level. So it's not enough to get, some nice D&I person or your head of HR to be working on gender issues. That's just not going to change the system. For companies really to adapt, it takes really systemic across the board. It's just like digital. I always say women and digital are very similar, right? Remember when we used to have a little department that took care of digital? That didn't work either, right? Digital is now everything. It's across every department. Well, gender is kind of the same. It's got to be mainstreamed as a management skill so that every single manager, whether they're male or female, by the way, I got a lot of women coming to me saying, look, I have an all-female team. Isn't it great? I said, no, it's not gender, but you're no better at working across genders than your male managers, right? And this is particularly challenging in things like healthcare. We want more male nurses, right? And we want more women in CEO leadership roles. Those are both the balancing exercise.
Okay. So I want to ask you about a time, it's more of a personal question, about a time where you had a major setback or failure and how you dealt with that and how you got back up.
It's really interesting because I get asked that question a lot. But because I which is something I really didn't know. I was raised by 2 academics, right, who thought that business was kinda dirty. Um, and yet I grew up to become kind of a serial entrepreneur type who've started and run different sorts of businesses, to where when you're an entrepreneur, failure, that word does not really, if you're a born one like I am, if there's a personality trait, there is not really failure. There's always learning. I mean,
Right.
you try something, either it resonates or it doesn't. I am usually astonished at how incapable I am of knowing what will work and what doesn't. Like that last blog, I thought that was a nice, light little piece of, Sunday, Easter Sunday entertainment. Did I
Right.
know that would go right? No, you don't know. And so I think a lot of what some people might consider failures, I tried it. If I'm not super attached to things working or not working, I am always super curious to see what do people need, what's a client or a market ready for, what resonates, and then you analyze, well, why, and you build on that kind of thing. So I argue a lot with this idea of failure. I have my husband is a big believer in failure and ascribes that word to himself all the time. I just don't buy the word.
I like that. I think we should just remove it from our vocabulary then.
Uh,
and and it and it seems like these various situations are what they are, various projects or ventures that may or may not end up being uh, long-standing, but it's all about the mindset and how you apply it in thinking of it. And when something isn't going to fly or isn't going to work out, you kind of, as a serial entrepreneur, you move on, right?
and it's not it's there's something about not taking it personally. Like it's
Hmm.
not something that's gonna. Now I think that comes in part from the luck of certain people to have succeeded enough to not be completely self-doubting and a
Hmm.
complete loss of confidence or imposter syndrome. I have bits of all of those things, but if you've managed to do a little bit enough of something that it gives you the courage to keep going and think you're got something to contribute, then I think the sort of up and downs of what resonates and what doesn't is managed a lot more easily. I
You,
think I should add, I think age is a huge benefit. So I am one of these people who loves old age. I think any woman listening to me, I hope, will realize the best years in life, personally and professionally, start at 50. We don't say it enough, but 50s, 60s, 70s. Look at that guy in the UK who just raised $8.5 million at 99 years old, walking up and down his garden, telling people that the NHS in the UK was something worth giving to. I think longevity opens up, especially for women, decades and decades of post-children time to flex our extraordinary contributory muscles and give to society after we've done some of the foundational stones of creating families and
hmm.
tucking them into the world.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it also, I think after 50, you hate yourself a lot less than you did before.
It's true. I think with every successive decade, you have these revelations about yourself and you know yourself a little bit better, and certain things that used to bother you don't bother you anymore. Would you say that's correct?
I mean, you know, we're all becoming more familiar with the human happiness curve that starts
Right,
to go back up after a long dip from like 20 to 55.
right.
We rediscover ourselves. So I would argue that our new longevity gives us the opportunity to work in a much happier phase of life where we aren't so self-judging. And I think we become more discerning about the kinds of people who give us energy and we should stay close to, and the
Mhm,
ones who drain us and are toxic and
mhm.
we need to let go of. We become much better at all those things with age, and that helps our productivity.
So, can you give me an example of one of the times where you felt a twinge of imposter syndrome? Even after you've been very successful in your career and you've been involved and launched multiple businesses.
Like, well, all the time. I mean, I am always all the time, every week, every new conference, every time I stand up in front of a large group or go, you know, get invited to some other unreal event, you know, I always just say, wow, whoever would have thought that little me, you know, from Canada, you know, would make it to be listened to. Whoever thought I'd write something that would be read by millions of people? All of those things give you a twinge. I hesitate a little bit with the imposter syndrome thing. It's just, it's, I would prefer to anchor that experience in a certain very useful sense of humility. Who
Mhm.
am I to say anything in the world? It's not automatic, which is why I don't ever expect it. When you say or write or are invited to speak somewhere, I'm always a little bit surprised. And then the feedback's always interesting. If it resonates, if somebody gets something out of your experience or perspective, it's always a bit of a surprise. Oh, they'd like that. That's interesting. Let's try it again. Let's develop that idea. Let's go deeper into it. Let's write a book. Let's scratch a little deeper into that topic. So I think this, I, I'd actually challenge the imposter syndrome because I also think it's overly attributed to women. I do a lot of
Yep.
coaching. I know a lot of men feel this too. And I think it's actually a really positive human trait.
It gives it
It's called humility.
exactly like you say, because the opposite of that is a little bit too much hubris, right? And even going back to your article and talking about how we lead and being truthful, a little bit too much hubris would destroy that, I think.
Well, and that's I think what we're all, again, we're going back to our initial position of women are always being evaluated on the basis of masculine characteristics. What is
Mhm.
emerging increasingly in all the leadership literature, and I'd point you all to my favorite guy on this is Thomas Chamorro Premuzic, who writes on HBR, and I linked to him in that last Forbes blog. Um, that you know, men are self-confident and we lack confidence. This is the constant refrain that drives me crazy. Women lack self-confidence and men have it, or some men have it. And what the leadership literature it keeps pointing to is that some men are overconfident and harm the organizations they work for
Mhm.
from this particular trait, which is not an accurate reflection of their skills, but an overly optimistic take on it. And actually, people are often overly optimistic of their performance. And what women seem to have is perhaps a more accurate assessment of where they fit that tends to be then heard or seen from a masculine perspective in a much more self-promoting culture and environment as
Mhm.
lacking confidence. I hope, will soon get over these old ideas and recognize humility and accuracy as the value they are, and get out of these horrible, loud, self-promoting, self-worshiping, narcissistic hero guys who are not good, not for their countries, not for their company,
Mhm.
Boy, they sure as hell aren't good for their couples, let me tell you.
Right, right. And in fact, in your most recent book, you wrote a little bit about the gender balance within couples as well. Is that correct?
Yes, I did. I did a rather more personal book on
Mm-hmm.
late love and mating and maturity because I got married quite late the second time round. And the interesting aspects of how gender balance is not only changing our workplaces, but is also changing our home lives. And that some couples evolve very positively through these shifts, and others uh, it's a bit more of a struggle, and that sometimes men will adapt and sometimes they won't. And knowing the difference is useful, and that increase, actually those statistics haven't changed for over a century. The majority of the only age where divorce is increasing significantly is in the 50s and 60s,
Mm.
is what I was writing about. So it's a lot of financially independent women. Two-thirds of divorces at that age are requested by women who are able, for the first time on a massive scale in history, to leave couples that aren't satisfying because they know they're going to live a long time. And do they want to spend the last 30 or 40 years of their lives with the same person they spent the last 30 or 40 years?
Yep.
And increasingly, the answer is no in a lot of cases. And so they change. And what does that change offer? Is a really lovely cherry on the cake phase of life. If for many of the women that I interviewed, and many of the men that I interviewed as well for this book, they discovered a kind of fantastic soulmate relationship, sometimes for the very first time in their very later decades. And it's a beautiful thing to witness and see.
If you had to give one piece of advice for a young woman who hopes to do what you do, be a leader of a company, be um, uh, a thought leader, um, what would that advice be?
Oh boy, I think the advice would probably be that know that life is way longer than you think it is right now, and that you will have multiple careers, multiple opportunities to become quite a different person several times over, eventually mate with several different people over the course of that time, maybe all with the same man or woman, but it will be a changing series of relationships. And so that you can pace yourself. I keep telling people life and work are becoming marathons rather than sprints. So to the young today, I'd say put on really good sneakers, really good sneakers for the long haul, and see life as a sequence of learning adventures that there's nothing you do that you can't learn from. Nothing, including misery and unhappiness and COVID recessions and things like that.
Yeah.
They will all teach us extraordinary lessons. And I think being open and curious to what they have in store for you and what you can derive for your own growth and understanding of the world and human nature. It's
Hmm.
all it's all good for the backpack. So get a really good set of sneakers and a really big backpack and start filling.
I love that. If our listeners want to keep up with you and find you online, can you tell us where they can do that?
It's not hard to find me online because I spent a lot of time. So my basic company address is 21st.com. That's 20 hyphen first, first.com. I also blog regularly both at Harvard Business Review and Forbes. I've written a bunch of books. You'll find them on Amazon, and a few TED Talks if you're really dying for more. But at that point, that'll probably be more than enough.
Thank you so much for being on with me today.
My great pleasure, Nancy. It's been great. I hope it helps somebody.
Thank you so much. That was great. I'm going to
Cool.
pause the recording.